A woman mysteriously disappeared from her own home, and her friends decided to go to the police. At first, it looked as if she herself had gone somewhere, but with each new clue, the case became more and more creepy. Eventually, investigators were able to uncover the mystery, and the truth turned out to be quite frightening. Welcome to A to Z Crime Stories. Before we start, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more. In New York City, Mindy Schloss was born in 1955. She relocated to Alaska when she was 25 and attended a local medical school there before earning her degree. After receiving a degree in psychiatry, the woman accepted a position as a nurse at Fairbanks Hospital. Many patients in Alaska's remote areas were unable to travel to the hospital on their own, so Mindy and her co-workers would use all available means of transportation, such as boats and airplanes, to reach them, even though the majority of the time she had to work in the field. She was passionate about her work and gave it her all. Mindy resided roughly 600 kilometers away from the Anchorage hospital. She flew to work, spent the week at a hotel, and returned home on the weekends. In August of that year, Mindy, 52 years old at the time, flew back to work after spending the weekend in Anchorage. She regularly requested her best friend Jerry to drop by her house during her absence to feed her cat and give him the medication he required. Her friend called her on Saturday, August 4, to discuss the situation, but Mindy didn't pick up. It seemed odd that she still hadn't been able to reach her all day, so Jerry called a mutual acquaintance who also hadn't reached Mindy all day. Jerry initially believed Mindy had left. She claimed to be away for work, but the next day she remained silent. When no one opened the door when her buddy's friend drove to her house, Jerry used her spare key. At first inspection, everything appeared to be in order. The house was clean, and there were no indications of a struggle or any other negative events involving Mindy. Only after leaving did the jurors notice anything odd. The front door's doorknob was loose, so the woman had used the screwdriver to tighten the screws. She then left and went to work. Jerry called the hospital where Mindy worked on Monday, August 6th, after learning where her companion had vanished to. She never showed up for work, which was extremely out of character for her, and she didn't call any of her co-workers to let them know she wasn't going to be there. All of this suggested that the woman may have experienced something, so Jerry chose to call the police. When Jerry and the investigator visited Mindy's residence once more after the police had taken a complaint of a missing person, they were unable to find any evidence of a break-in. Nothing of value was also gone from the premises, ruling out the likelihood that a burglar had entered the woman's residence. Some of the prescriptions Mindy kept at home were those that required a prescription from a doctor. They were in high demand among drug addicts, so any burglar would have most certainly taken them. When they got into the garage, they saw that Mindy's car was gone. It was also highly odd that the woman only used her car to move around town and always took a cab to the airport. The detectives came to the conclusion that the woman had experienced something quite awful. A forensic team searched the home for any hints, but they came up empty-handed. The hypothesis of a kidnapping was improbable. The police believed that Mindy may have been in an accident. She frequently traveled through rural areas where the terrain was rather hazardous. People can have gone from a cliff unintentionally or became prey to wild animals. However, the authorities were not any closer to solving the crime as a result of this argument. Decided to start looking for people who, in theory, might be connected to her disappearance. They started by checking on the acquaintance of Bob, Mindy, and Jerry. The police were able to immediately ascertain that the man was working far from the woman's home on the day of her disappearance because to the man's want to assist with the investigation. The cops were unsure about the precise time that Mindy vanished. Since Saturday, the woman has been in touch. Experts examined her computer and found that at 1:30 a.m., she used it for the last time. Police decided to ask the public for assistance later that day because they had no strong leads. They sent the missing woman's information to local TV stations and plastered leaflets regarding her whereabouts across the community. The following day, they started getting calls from witnesses, but the most of the leads were dead ends. People claimed to have seen Mindy in numerous locations, including in other states. These leads were never of any use. In the meantime, Bob and his co-workers made the decision to search the region where Mindy may have. The detectives tried a different approach and contacted the bank the woman used. They asked them to check to see if there had been any activity on her cards in recent days, and this is where a serious lead finally awaited them early Sunday morning, the day after Mindy went missing. Someone had withdrawn $500 from her debit card, the maximum amount allowed, and she had been out in the country quite frequently for berries or just out for a walk. Unfortunately, the search also produced no results. The bank's ATM video footage was promptly seized by the authorities, who discovered a terrible scene. It turned out that an unidentified individual had taken the money out. They were unable to recognize him because of the scarf covering his face. Only until his face was hidden from the camera's view did he remove the bandana. The only option left to the cops was to wait until the man attempted to use some person's card. The cops received another tip in the meanwhile. They discovered through Mindy's co-workers that she was preparing to remodel her house and had at one time employed employees. She and their boss had a disagreement on the reason for the work. Later, Mindy confessed to her co-workers that she was scared of him since he behaved suspiciously when he came to her house. Police checked on the man, but it turned out that he had a plausible explanation for why the woman vanished on that particular day. Another employee who visited her home on Friday about 7 p.m. was also questioned. The man was also uninvolved, and he had no memory of anything odd happening that evening. Within a short period of time, detectives had the 500 charge on Mindy's card occurred again early in the morning, but this time from a different ATM, according to a new lead bank security report. The cops knew it was the same individual after reviewing the security camera, but there was something strange on the recording. The man took the cash out and walked away, but he soon went back to the ATM. Pushing buttons as he moved around it, he eventually left once more. After contacting the bank detectives, they learned what was causing his odd behavior. This time, the police managed to find a witness who drove up to the exact same ATM when an unidentified man came out of there. According to the witness, he got on his bicycle and rode away. It was a significant lead since most people don't remember the ATM taking the card away to prevent the theft. The real owner can get it back by going to the bank with his ID. Of course, this was not an option for the criminal, so he lost access to Minnie's account forever. This time, the police managed to find a witness. Detectives chose to interrogate everyone in the Mindy area because the available information was still insufficient to draw them closer to a clue. They inquired about any peculiar occurrences or suggested any suspect neighbors. Unexpectedly, a number of locals named a house that was close to Mindy's home. They claimed that there were always celebrations there. The locals were constantly making noise and upsetting the peace. The detectives got there and discovered that there were quite a few residents, but they were unwilling to speak with the detectives. A woman who lived just across the street from the house was the next place the detectives went. She claimed that she did not notice anything odd, but it was clear from the way she was acting that she was quite tense. The woman called the police station the following day and begged the detectives to meet, but not at her home. They met elsewhere, and the woman told them a spooky tale. A man who lived across the street paid the detectives a visit not long before that. He claimed that police were patrolling the area and requested that she not let them know that he lived here. She heard someone strolling on her porch when she asked why he claimed to be on parole and did not want the police to know where he was at night. She noticed he was the same man when she peered out the window. He walked around, peered into a few windows, and then walked away. Because she was so terrified, the woman made the decision to call the police. Josh Wayne, who was 27 years old at the time, was his name, according to the detectives. When they put him through the database, they discovered that he had been found guilty of murder. He had been suspected of killing a woman by beating her 7 years prior, but a jury had found him not guilty. Josh spent 3 years in jail before being charged with tampering with evidence and given a 6.5-year prison term. He was let go. He was immediately recognized as a key suspect by early detectives. When authorities started looking for Josh, they learned from his housemates that he didn't own a car and primarily traveled by bicycle. However, there was just one issue. Man has vanished. Without a trace on Thursday, August 9th, police received a call from a local trucker who claimed to have seen Mindy's car in a parking lot close to the airport, giving them an unexpected new lead. He instantly recognized the automobile after seeing its photo in the newspapers. When detectives arrived on the site, they were able to verify that the car was actually Mindy's. They also observed that a nearby building had a surveillance camera directed at the parking lot, so they asked for a recording. It displayed a man operating this vehicle into on August 4 at 12:30 p.m. He exited the parking lot and appeared to wipe off his fingerprints by wiping down the door handle. Regrettably, the clarity of the camera prevented us from seeing his face. Although it took some time to analyze the samples and there was no assurance they would be helpful in the case, CSI was able to recover some samples while searching the car for prints or signs of DNA. Mindy's purse was on the passenger seat, which might have been a sign that she had been in the car with the offender, alive or dead. Using cutting-edge analysis technologies, they are now obtaining the desired outcomes. A search dog strategy was chosen by the detectives. Since Mindy had been missing for a week, few people thought this concept would work, but they had run out of ideas and turned to filming dogs. The service, both Mindy's car and the ATMs where the unidentified man had withdrawn cash, were visited by the dog. 3 streets away, at the woman's house, the dog followed the route and started walking down the street. She smelled the front door and went straight to the residence that Josh Wayne had formerly occupied. When the service dog pointed straight to the fact that Josh was in Mindy's car close to her house and those ATMs, the detectives, who up until that moment had not believed in the search dog concept, were taken aback. The exercise was repeated the next day by the police with a different search dog. The outcome was the same. The dogs made it to Josh's house after walking the entire distance. The detectives chose not to waste their time investigating, even if it was not unqualified proof that would be accepted in court. They proceeded to the suspect's home after obtaining a warrant for his arrest. But the man hadn't been there for days. After inspecting the building, they discovered the jacket that the mysterious man had been seen wearing on the security cameras by the ATMs. A cash withdrawal slip from Mindy's card was also discovered in the jacket's pocket. They then came across a woman's gold watch and showed it to Jerry right away. The watch belonged to Mindy, the woman said. In order to compare, the DNA samples discovered on the tests from items from Mindy's home matched, proving that Josh had been in the automobile that belonged to the missing woman. The police were concentrated on apprehending the culprit because the evidence was already significantly more serious. His name was on flyers that were distributed around the city, and they even rented a number of billboards. Detectives said that it was one of the biggest manhunts ever conducted in Alaska. Nearly all law enforcement agencies were involved in the investigation, and at one point locals reported any questionable material. Point after the police revealed ATM camera images, Lisa, a lady, approached them almost immediately. She claimed she had previously seen Josh and was certain he was the person in the picture. The fact that the police did not identify the primary suspect is what matters most in this instance, but what happened next is what made the case turn. Josh's second friend turned up at the police station with a confession. She had been driving him about town for the previous week to assist him get around. He left his bag in the back seat one day, and the teenager and her mother peered inside, where they discovered a phone in the gallery and several more ATM receipts. They also discovered a picture in which Josh is allegedly brandishing a gun for the police. Detectives were already concerned that the suspect may attack someone else while they were looking for him, and now that they knew his phone was also armed, their concerns were only raised. The officers pleaded with Josh's girlfriend to go with them and meet them with a tape recorder so they could record Josh. They would try to persuade him to discuss what he had done to Mindy, but the girl was too terrified and soon refused. She was compelled to participate despite her will, nevertheless. On September 2nd, Josh showed up at her house and started yelling at her to give him her backpack. She had to quickly come up with an explanation after realizing she didn't have the backpack since the young woman had delivered it to the police. The young woman declined Josh's request to be taken somewhere far from here where he could escape the cops. She offered to let him remain at her house, but Josh fled since he felt uneasy. She decided to follow him covertly in her car and call the detectives along the way after realizing that she would now be safe until the cops caught the man. Josh eventually arrived at the residence of his friend and entered. Police, SWAT, and the FBI had already started to arrive on the area by that point. Everyone was concerned that the suspect would not give himself up without a fight, and utilizing force, those concerns came true. Josh held 2 persons hostage who were also there in the home. But after several hours of negotiation, a lawyer was able to persuade Josh to let up. He rarely spoke to the authorities during the interview, but the detectives were slow to accuse him of killing Mindy. Josh was only charged with swiping Mindy's bank card because at that point, they already believed the woman was most likely dead, but they couldn't prove it without her body. As a result, the FBI agent decided to get crafty. He recounted the accusations made against Josh and said they were all false. When Mindy went to the police to report the card theft, the investigator said that they had evidence that he was the one who had taken the money from someone else's card. The suspect became upset when he heard this and questioned what games they were trying to play with him. The FBI agent was ultimately persuaded by Josh's response that Mindy had been murdered, but the police still needed to locate Mindy's body in order to accuse Josh of the crime. They had no possibility of locating Mindy's remains if they became buried in the snow because it had started snowing early in that region. About 100 miles away from Anchorage, in the vicinity of the town of Wasilla, an electrician called the police on September 13th. He saw a woman's body in a wooded area and knew it was Mindy at once. The lab's experts verified that the deceased was in fact Mindy. The woman had been shot in the back of the head, according to the medical assessment, and her body had been burned to death. When the bullet was found, it was discovered that Josh had been captured using the same firearm that had fired the shot. The only thing left for the cops to do was to reconstruct the sequence of events that resulted in Mindy's demise. The specialists continued to search every square inch of her home for signs of Josh's presence in the interim. It was incredibly challenging to perform. They had to gather almost every hair from Mindy's home's floor and test it in the lab. Months passed, but ultimately was successful in locating a hair that belonged to Josh. The detectives now had concrete evidence that the suspect was present in the victim's home on May 18, 2008, 10 months after the murder, thanks to DNA tests that had proved this. Josh's ex-girlfriend Lisa, who had recognized him from a picture of him next to an ATM, declined to appear in court, which created an unusual situation as the prosecution gathered witnesses to testify against Josh. She frequently visited her ex-boyfriend incarcerated, and the duo once declared their investigators were surprised by this turn of events because they had intended to help Mary, but they soon recognized what was going on. Family members are not allowed to testify against one another under the U.S. Constitution, and Josh likely persuaded Lisa to marry him for this reason. There was just one issue. The marriage was quickly deemed null and void after it was consummated. Marriages between inmates were forbidden by the estate law. However, the investigators questioned Josh's extreme behavior in protecting Lisa from interrogation and testimony. Was it actually? Investigators tried to talk to the young woman but initially were unsuccessful. However, eventually Lisa herself contacted them and claimed that Josh confessed to her about the murder during one of her visits to the prison. According to Josh's story, there was a party at his house on Friday night, and Josh, who had no other means of support, decided to sneak into the house next. The young woman was likely aware of a lot more information. Josh flung open the door to the home and started looking around for valuables. He suddenly understood that if he continued to let Mindy live at this point, he would not be able to avoid going to jail. He seized the woman, led her to the restroom, and bound her hands since he didn't want to go back there. The criminal then went to his house to grab a gun, while also taking a few useful items to utilize in the kidnapping. He wrapped her legs in sacks and duct taped them before going back to Mindy's house. He then brought the woman to the garage, put her in his own car, and drove out of town, leaving no trail. After a half hour of driving, he pulled off in a wooded area and took Mindy off the road, where he killed her. Josh then left her home after cleaning and vacuuming the carpet. The trial didn't start until the following spring. In exchange for Josh confessing to killing Mindy and another lady 7 years prior, the prosecution agreed to drop the death penalty. Josh concurred because the goal was to resolve two prominent cases simultaneously. Consequently, at the reading of the sentence, he was given a prison term of 99 years without the possibility of parole. Josh sobbed, but at one point the judge called him a coward for stealing the lives of two ladies, which caused things to get hot. "What about the man I killed?" yelled the criminal as he leaped to his feet. Right now, before he could continue speaking, attorneys seized him and put him to quiet. Until Josh himself gave authorities a fresh agreement in 2014, those yells kept the detectives busy for 5 long years. He consented to tell the truth about killing 3 guys in exchange for being moved from a local to a federal jail. Given that the criminal's request was so trivial, it appears that the standards were much higher there. The government agreed. Josh claimed that in 1994, when he was just 14 years old, he killed 1 man in Anchorage. In 1999, he committed murder and killed a 3rd man. The first 2 guys had been recognized a year later. On the same day he killed the woman, but the 3rd man's name is still unknown. Josh was definitely engaged in the killings, but the real concern for the investigators is whether he has any additional crimes to his credit that he is keeping quiet about. In any case, the authorities were able to permanently cut him off from society and stop the other murders that were certain to occur. Share your opinion on the story in the comments and don't forget to like it if you liked the video. Thanks for watching. In this video, we'll discuss crimes perpetrated between 1996 and 2014. Despite the wide time span, all of these crimes had one thing in common. They were all committed along Virginia's Route 29, a major thoroughfare. The police looking into these crimes made several attempts, some of which were successful, to connect the incidents in some way. Some of the criminals referenced in this video may have already come up in separate investigations, though. Here, we'll try to look at the events from the standpoint of several offenses. In 1996, more than 20 women went to the police and said they had all been chased by a man in a pickup truck on Virginia's Route 29. He would communicate an issue with their automobiles and flash his headlights. A white male between the ages of 35 and 45 with reddish-brown hair who was driving a pickup vehicle was characterized as this individual. He earned the moniker Route 29 Stalker, 25-year-old Alicia Reynolds. Alicia Reynolds said her husband Mark farewell on March 2, 1996, at 7:30 in the morning in Baltimore, Maryland, and left for Charlottesville, Virginia. She had a meeting with her mother scheduled for 10:30 a.m., but she had nearly 150 miles to travel. She held off till 11:30 a.m. Alicia's mother contacted her husband Mark, but did not hear from her daughter. Mark informed her that Alicia had departed 4 hours prior, and that by that time, even without rushing, she should have arrived. After making the decision to call the police, Alicia's car was eventually discovered at 6 p.m. on the side of Route 29. Despite being close to Culpeper, Alicia was nowhere to be found. When the car was inspected, there were no indications of a crime, and afterwards, specialists said the car was mechanically fine. What caused the young woman to leave her automobile unattended is unknown. An inquiry was launched. Soon, witnesses who had observed Alicia conversing with a man in a blue pickup truck on the side of the road were located. The alleged first victim of the stalker on Route 29 is Alicia Reynolds. All the women who had been pursued by the man in the pickup truck before she vanished and who hadn't previously recognized they were in danger came forward to the police and related their interactions with the unidentified pursuer after she vanished. It was discovered that 3 other ladies had previously dated in addition to Alicia. 2 of them were delivered to their destinations in the pickup truck, but the 3rd woman, Carmelita Shomo, was not. Sadly, no picture of her could be located. A week before Alicia vanished, Carmelita stopped at his request. She saw someone flashing their headlights at her in the rearview mirror as she was traveling home from work on Route 29 that wet night. She stopped, and the pickup truck's driver followed suit. She was said there were sparks as the man approached her after getting out of his car. He then offered to give her a ride home, and she consented, telling him that it was coming from underneath her car while she was driving, and that it might be unsafe to keep using it. The pickup truck stopped on the side of the road after a brief trip, and the woman was then attacked. Despite having a fractured ankle, she was able to get out of the pickup truck and draw the attention of oncoming traffic, which startled the driver and caused him to speed away. However, Carmelita, an immigrant with poor English language, reported the event to the police. At that moment, no steps were done to identify the pickup truck driver due to the police officer's dismissive attitude and lack of respect for her word. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, the police were unaware that their incompetence would eventually result in a tragedy for the Reynolds family. 2 months after going missing, Alicia was not located. Her body was located 15 miles from where her car was found, in a forested location. Laura Winans is 26 years old, and Julianne Williams is 24. May 1996, the same month that Alicia Reynolds' remains were found again, saw the father of Julianne Williams call the police on May 31st to report his daughter missing. She hadn't arrived at the appointed time since she and Laura Winans were on vacation in Shenandoah National Park. They were last seen extending their stay at the campground on May 24th at around 5:30 p.m. Following the police report, park rangers found the two women's bodies the following day. They were both killed by incisions to their necks and the binding of their wrists. Authorities gave May 28th plus or minus 30 hours as the date of death. It was discovered that there had been no sexual activity before the victims' deaths, and their possessions were still in their tent. We shall return to this incident later. This motiveless crime baffled detectives, and the authorities were unable to crack the case right away. Sophia Silva, 16, is a teenager. On September 9, 1996, 3 months later, 16-year-old Sophia Silva vanished from her yard in Spotsylvania County without leaving any evidence of a struggle. Numerous searches. Sadly, it didn't produce any results.
Her remains was discovered in a King George County creek a month later. The test found that Carolyn McDaniel was 20 years old and that Sophia Silva had also experienced sexual assault before to her death. 20-year-old Anne Carolyn McDaniel left her home in Orange and vanished 12 days after Sophia Silva was kidnapped. Occasionally, hitchhiking was something Carolyn McDaniel enjoyed doing. She was last saw hitchhiking on the road on September 20th, 1996. Her burned bones were discovered 2 days later, located in Culpeper County, only 15 miles from the location of Alicia Reynolds' body. Katie Lisk was 12 years old, and Kristen Lisk was 15. Despite the police's best efforts, 7 months had gone since Anne Carolyn McDaniel's death was discovered, and none of these crimes had any solid suspects. In the meantime, Spotsylvania, where Sophia Silva was kidnapped on May 1, 1997, was shaken by a fresh incident. Kristen Liske, 15, and her sister Katie, 12, went missing. The girls would typically contact their father when they got home from school because he was at work at the time. On this particular day, though, the father didn't hear from his girls, so he began making calls home. He went home right away because there was no response. None of the nearby residents had seen the girls, and they were nowhere to be found. The girls had come back, as shown by the bag with their school books that had been placed on the grass. But something had transpired since I got there. In the wake of it, a police report was made, and some 1,500 people joined the hunt for the girls. Their bodies were found in the South River, 40 miles from their house, 5 days later. The test revealed that drowning was the cause of death. Strangely, the water discovered in their lungs was probably clear tap water, much like in Sophia Silva's case. In their last moments, the girls' sexual integrity had been compromised. The types of crimes and some supporting evidence shown that a single person was responsible for these crimes. A Canadian visitor was riding in Shenandoah National Park on July 9, 1997, when she heard the sound of an approaching automobile. She was expecting the car to drive past, but it didn't. She noticed that the car was approaching her in an odd manner. The pickup truck's driver tossed a soda can at her before getting out and ordering her to take off her clothes. The woman tossed a water bottle at him and used her hands to block his path as he approached her. He tried to drag her into the car, using the bicycle as a barrier, but when he realized he couldn't, he got back in the driver's seat and tried to run her over. Being discouraged by yet another failure, she managed to hide behind a downed tree. The woman saw it as hell when a ranger just so happened to be walking by. He immediately radioed a description of the vehicle, a blue Chevrolet truck, and the person who was arrested as they were leaving the park. The culprit was identified as a 28-year-old man. On April 10, 2002, Daryl David Rice received his sentence of 11 years and 3 months in jail after pleading guilty to the attack in March 1999. In relation to the instances of Laura Winans and Julianne Williams, Rice was charged. To refresh your memory, the young women's deaths were reportedly expected to occur around May 28th, give or take 30 hours. It was discovered that Rice entered the park at around 8 o'clock in the evening by reviewing surveillance camera footage from that time. Dated May 25th. He returned to the park the following day at 5 p.m. and was seen on camera visiting the park on June 1st, 1996, the day the young women's bodies were discovered. Rice knew he would likely receive the death penalty, so he hired a strong defense team that eventually had the accusations against him withdrawn. A hair discovered on the sticky tape used to bind the young woman was later determined through new DNA testing technologies to not belong to Rice. He was cleared of those charges in April 2004 due to insufficient evidence. But Rice's legal struggles were far from ended. The blue pickup truck he was driving when he was stopped belonged to his father, who resided close to Highway 29 in Virginia and was accused of being the Route 29 stalker. His attorney expertly handled the problem once more. When Rice was named as the attacker during the 2005 trial, Carmeliere Shomo, the woman who had successfully resisted the attack and broken her ankle in the process, pointed to a completely different person when she was shown photographs of men for identification prior to the trial. Years ago, in the middle of the night, the defense was able to sow a seed of doubt in her mind, making her wonder if Rice was the criminal. The defense team successfully exploited this uncertainty, which led to the charges being dropped. Additionally, there was no evidence linking Rice's actions to the Alicia Reynolds case, which is regarded as an incident involving the Route 29 stalker. Cases of harassment on the highway were only seized following Reynolds' disappearance. Additionally, nothing suggested Rice's involvement in the incidents in question, Spotsylvania and Orange. Despite numerous circumstantial evidence that the Route 29 stalker was in fact him, it was impossible to prove. As a result, the identity of the driver of the pickup truck that scared women is still unknown. Even with the given prize, the police made a concerted effort to solve these crimes, but they were unable to come any closer to the offender. 15-year-old Carol Robinson was at her friend's house on June 24, 2002, in Columbia, South Carolina, while an acquaintance showered. When a man with some pamphlets in his hands approached, Kara was watering the flowers in front of the house. He requested that Kara give her parents the items. He held a gun to her neck as she walked up to him and told her to get in his car. When he brought Kara to his house, she was chained and repeatedly forced to have sex while the kidnapper was fast asleep. Kara was able to free herself, make her way outside, and eventually find a police station. She had been held captive at the station for 18 hours. Everything she recollected helped the police find her abductor, but by that point, he had managed to escape. The perpetrator was identified as Richard Mark, 38, an honorable man who appeared to be just like everyone else. Mark is a former member of the military who is married and works. He had left the Navy in 1987 after being exposed to a 15-year-old girl and her 3-year-old sister, it was learned. For this offense, he was given a 3-year sentence with probation. He was captured by the police in Sarasota. Ivana made the decision to commit suicide after realizing he had no other option and was marked by a gunshot and a burst of light. It was determined that he was involved in the cases of Sophia Silva, Kristen, and Katie Lisk, after inspecting his home and comparing the available evidence. The threads on the corpses of the ladies were an exact match to the strands on his bathroom carpeting. It's unbelievable, but forensic specialists were able to locate Kristen Lisk's fingerprints in the car's trunk 5 years after the crime. DNA testing. By examining the facts, it was finally determined who killed Sophia Silva Kristen and Katie Lisk, and it was also shown that his early life had a big impact on who he would become. When Mark was 6 years old, his father Joseph was giving him a bath, and water went into his eyes, causing him to scream. Mark's father Joseph was an alcoholic, and his mother was openly having affairs with other men. Joseph was enraged by this, and the child at the time claimed that his father intended to drown him. Family members claim that Joseph also drowned, leaving their dog's mark right in front of him. The pattern of his subsequent crimes is thought to have been influenced by this event. Drowning his prey, Additionally, he was looked into for possible connections to the incidents on Route 29 and the Alicia Reynolds case, but none were found. Reports of the Route 29 stalker ended once the witnesses were dead, and Rice was incarcerated serving his sentence. But soon after, girls started reporting it again. Started vanishing once more in Virginia in 2005. An unidentified 26-year-old woman from Fairfax, Virginia, was being carried into a wooded area after being attacked from behind on Rock Garden Drive, while she was returning home on foot from a nearby store. Dark and poorly populated, it was already. She fought back vehemently and shouted, but the attacker eventually overwhelmed her around 10 p.m. He coerced her into a sexual act before starting to choke her. Thankfully, a bystander who was nearby heard the woman's cries and ran to help. The attacker made it away, and the police were able to collect a sample of his DNA. They also produced a composite sketch, but they were unable to capture him using this information right away. On October 10, 2009, Cassandra Morton, at age 23, was in Lynchburg. Cassandra Morton, age 23, vanished. She was last spotted on Park Avenue, which is located in Lynchburg's downtown. The only information the police could find when her family reported her missing was that she got into a black car with someone. Her remains were discovered 6 weeks later. Her body had been strewn with rocks by a passerby who had just passed by the last spot she had been seen. 20-year-old Morgan Dana Harrington was last seen in Lynchburg 7 days after Cassandra Morton vanished. Morgan Dana Harrington, age 20, vanished in Charlottesville, a nearby city 70 miles distant. On that terrible day, October 17, 2009, she was a student at a technological university. She and her pals went to see Metallica perform. When his opening band was on stage, she informed her friends that she would use the bathroom and then come back. Her pals were concerned because she had been gone for a while. When they called her at 8:48 p.m., she replied that she was outside the arena but was prohibited from entering due to the no re-entry rule. She also indicated that she was going home, but nobody seemed to think about how she would get there for some reason. No one can figure out why she left the arena since she never came back. She said that she needed to use the restroom, yet there are facilities inside the arena. It's still unclear how she got outside, or either it is genuinely unknown, or it is kept quiet for image purposes. Her wallet and phone were discovered the following day in a parking area close to the arena. 2 months later, on January 26, 2010, witnesses were located who had seen a young lady who resembled Morgan Harrington voting at a nearby bridge. A farmer in Albemarle County, 10 miles from the arena where the performance was held, found her bones. Later, the daughter's parents admitted that she was coerced into having a sexual encounter in the final moments of her life. Samantha Ann Clark, 19, vanished in Orange on September 13, 2010, when she was 19 years old. When Samantha left the house at 1:30 a.m. on the day of the incident, her mother Barbara was working the night shift. Her younger brother, who was 12 years old, stayed at home with her. He called his mother to let her know Samantha had left. When Barbara got home the next morning, she found her daughter's pajamas lying on the bed, indicating the teenager had changed before leaving. Admonish Samantha about threats he'd heard from friends. At the time, Taylor was not connected to Samantha Clark's disappearance in any way that the police could discover. The investigation came to a halt since the phone calls were insufficient to support any charges. Age 19 for Saga Smith, 19, vanished in the same Charlottesville, 3 years after Morgan Harrington went missing there on November 20th, 2012. She informed her roommate of her plans to that particular day as she was leaving her home. No one saw her again after that. The name of the guy she was meant to meet, Eric McFadden, was discovered by the police. He admitted during questioning that he was scheduled to meet with Sage, but that it never took place because he had other matters to take care of while the police were determining their next course of action. Alexis Murphy, 17, left her home in a truck close to Lynchburg, approximately a 30-minute drive away, while McFadden departed. She and her dad had made a deal that she had never broken the rule that she had to be home by midnight. The first time Alexis didn't arrive home by midnight was on August 3, 2013, and her grandmother instantly recognized a problem. The calls went to voicemail, so they were unable to speak with Alexis on the phone. Alexis was well liked on social media and had many of friends. In an effort to locate Alexis, her parents contacted anyone who may have seen her on the day of her disappearance. This effort helped crack the case, attracted a lot of social media attention, and was featured in national news. People talked about the path Alex was scheduled to take via the notorious Route 29 from the shipment to Lynchburg, a movie theater in Charlottesville, Virginia, 40 miles from Alexis's house, and in the other direction from Lynchburg, where she was headed, was where her white Nissan, which she usually traveled in, was discovered 3 days after she vanished. Although the area was cordoned off, forensic specialists could find no evidence of a crime in the car. One was made in the investigation. Surveillance footage from the Livingston Liberty gas station provided a breakthrough in the investigation. Detectives carefully reviewed the video, which was captured on Saturday, the day Alexis left her house for Lynchburg. A slim-built man who held the door open for Alexis as he entered the building caught their attention in particular. The cashier who worked that day admitted to the police that there had been a brief exchange between the man, and the cashier also clearly remembers a Daffy Duck tattoo on the man's neck and the fact that he was driving a camouflage SUV after Alexis had paid and left for her car. The man exited the petrol station first, and Alexis followed shortly after, according to further analysis of the video. However, given that she was traveling in the direction of Lynchburg, this might have been a coincidence. Another video clip of the same person was obtained by the police. It was taken by a camera at an adult business in Charlottesville 1 hour before he at the petrol station appeared. He bought a movie from the selection offered at those shops, but the key finding was that Randy Taylor was indeed the man who had made the purchase. On the night of her abduction, Samantha Clark had received a call from the same person. The whereabouts of Randy Taylor was promptly discovered by the police. Only 1.5 miles separated him from the gas station and his mobile home. A search warrant might be obtained thanks to video evidence showing Alexis Murphy and Randy Taylor interacting on the day of her disappearance. Anything that might be connected to Alexis's disappearance was taken by FBI officers. Inside the trailer, they discovered 3 items that were particularly noteworthy: black hair, a severed artificial nail, and an earring stud. In close proximity to Randy Taylor's porch, within 20 meters, they discovered a broken phone that was also taken in for inspection. Within 2 days, the outcomes showed that it was Alexis Murphy's phone. Analyses proved Randy Taylor's connection to the missing girl. The earring, nail, and hair that were discovered in his home belonged to Alexis. Alexis Murphy was still missing 11 days after she vanished, despite the fact that Randy Taylor had been taken into custody. When Taylor arrived at the courthouse, he was accused of kidnapping. Taylor began to speak when he recognized that the police were looking for information that would implicate him in both the kidnapping and the death of the missing young woman. However, his statement was now what everyone knew. He said that day Alexis was in his trailer as expected, but she wasn't there by herself. She was there with a black man named Damian Bradley who had dreadlocks. The authorities found evidence that Alexis and Damian Bradley had indeed interacted online and met in person. They visited Taylor's trailer, according to Taylor, to sell plants they were growing, and they had a beer. Taylor utilized a physical struggle between Alexis and her friend at some time to explain why Alexis's DNA was found in the police investigated Damian Bradley's alibi and discovered that he was in another state at the time. It seemed as though Taylor was merely attempting to place the responsibility elsewhere. In the meantime, FBI officers went back to the trailer for another push, and it worked. They discovered Taylor's t-shirt, which was worn the day Alexis vanished, and was now wrinkled below the couch. Eyelashes and hair extensions that are frequently used as extensions were wrapped within. After inspection, it was discovered that the eyelashes and hair were These pieces of evidence were sufficient to accuse Randy Taylor of both the kidnapping and the murder of Alexis Murphy on May 8, 2014. Randy Taylor was given 2 consecutive life sentences in July after being found guilty on all counts. Taylor said he would divulge the whereabouts of Alexis's body if his 2 life sentences were lowered to 20 years in prison in response to Alexis's family, eliminating any remaining concerns regarding his role in the young woman's abduction. Declared that they would not engage in negotiations and would never give Taylor the chance to escape and hurt someone else. Before Alexis Murphy's family had any prospect of being able to say goodbye to her, nearly 6 hard years had gone. Human remains were found on private land on December 3, 2020, and on February 5, 2021, it was determined that the bones belonged to Alexis Murphy. Although Taylor was said to have disclosed the location of the remains, no agreements were made with him, and his sentence is still in place. It's important to note that Samantha Clark's case, who aired in 2010 and was tied to Taylor, was reclassified on January 15, 2021, and is now being handled as a homicide investigation. On September 13, 2014, Hannah Graham, an 18-year-old student, vanished from Charlottesville. She was last seen in the early hours of the morning at a mall. Extensive searches involving more than 1,000 volunteers were carried out a week after Hannah vanished, but she was not discovered. She was seen on surveillance video and the police found it. Jesse Matthew, 32, was recognized as the individual seen with Hannah in the video recordings. His flat was searched, but he wasn't taken into custody. He was named as a suspect in Hannah Graham's kidnapping 4 days after that. When a warrant was issued for Matthew's arrest, he had already left. The following day, he was captured in Galveston, Texas. He was thought to be planning to flee the nation and traveled to Mexico. On September 29, 2014, it was revealed that information gathered during Morgan Harrington's case linked Jesse Matthew to her death. Remains were discovered in Albemarle County on October 18, 2014, and they were eventually recognized as Hannah Graham's. Notably, these remains were located within 5 miles from the location of Morgan Harrington's remains. Matthew was charged with Hannah Graham's kidnapping on February 10, 2015, and on September 15 of that same year, he was also charged in connection with the Morgan Harrington case. However, it was later discovered that Hannah Graham and Morgan Harrington were after a month of study. A number of Jesse Matthew victims fled Liberty University in Lynchburg after one of the female students accused him of rape. He was able to avoid punishment nevertheless, since the complainant abandoned the allegations. After enrolling at Christopher Newport University in Newport News a few days later in January 2003, Matthew was once more the target of the same accusations. The victim again retracted the accusations after the university police looked into the issue. Matthew, from January 15 to October 15 of 2003, I attended Newport University. There were 2 missing ladies during this time. The fate of Without a Trace and their locations are still unknown. No evidence linking Matthew to their cases or the Cassandra Morton case was discovered, despite the police's investigation into any possible connections between their disappearances and Matthew. With this knowledge, there is only one question that can be asked. If the police had done their job properly, and both colleges where the complaints were made, at least 2 lives would have been saved if Matthew had persevered in the cases without worrying about damaging their image. In Charlottesville, Matthew started working as a cab driver in 2005. It's important to note that in the same year, a woman traveling home from work in Fairfax was attacked. In the Fairfax case, Jesse Matthew was charged with 3 counts of kidnapping, and the police were able to get a DNA sample from the culprit at the time, which has since been found to match Jesse Matthews' DNA. First off, he was found guilty on all 3 counts and given a life sentence for each one on October 2, 2015. In addition to the 3 life sentences he has previously been given as of this writing, in the instances of Alicia Reynolds and Morgan Harrington, he was sentenced to 4 further life terms for each of those crimes on March 2, 2016. The positions of Sage Smith, Carolyn McDaniel, Samantha Ann Clark, Laura Winans, and Julianne Williams are still available. It is challenging when you look at these faces. It is difficult to think what additional horrors they may have kept buried in their closets, and it is much more difficult to comprehend the suffering they have caused the victims' loved ones. Share your opinion on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching. Yo. An 18-year-old woman went to another city in her car before going missing. The young woman vanished without a trace, and a week later, her body was discovered in a river. The police had no suspects, and her car wasn't located for years. It wasn't until 14 years later that the young woman's family discovered the horrific reality. The small American hamlet of Covington, Tennessee, is where Lisa Kimmel was born on July 18, 1969. Her parents soon welcomed 2 more children, and in 1972, the family relocated to Billings. The girl stood out from a young age for her. She worked part-time at a nearby restaurant and assisted her parents in caring for their younger sisters, demonstrating independence and tenacity. Because of this, she acquired a brand new Honda CRX before high school graduation. Little Miss, as she was frequently referred to by her parents and sisters, was added to the young woman's license plate, and this plate would play an important part in the overall plot. Despite the opposition of her parents, Lisa chose to continue working at the restaurant after graduating from high school in 1987. The young woman planned to pursue a profession in her chosen field against her parents' concerns. They wanted their daughter to attend college. They ultimately decided Lisa would work for a year and still think about attending college. Soon after graduating, Lisa was presented with a management post, but she was already in another city. The young woman worked at a huge chain restaurant called Arby's alongside her mother, who was the regional manager there. She was expected to relocate to the Denver suburbs, nearly 900 kilometers away from her home, and run a restaurant there. It was a significant assignment for the 18-year-old, who had just graduated from high school, but Lisa embraced it without hesitation. Her mother also visited Denver frequently for work, and they saw each other virtually weekly. The young woman occasionally drove herself to her family's home in Billings. Lisa worked at a restaurant in the city of Aurora. She moved in promptly, rented an apartment, and was generally enthusiastic about her new situation. She met several new friends. She started dating Ed a few months later. He lived 800 miles distant yet frequently traveled to Aurora. On March 25, 1988, a Friday, Lisa was getting ready eagerly for the weekend. For the weekend, she had numerous plans. To finally reveal her boyfriend to her family, she planned to travel to Billings with him. He resided in Cody, Wyoming, close to where she was traveling. Lisa had intended to pick him up and accompany him on their journey. At around 4 o'clock, she left Aurora. After traveling roughly 400 kilometers, she had about 7 hours to drive to the boyfriend's place. Lisa reached Douglas, Wyoming. Apparently, she was rushing since at 9 o'clock at night, a police officer pulled her car up for speeding based on his radar readings. When the police issued Lisa a $120 fine, she was traveling at a speed of roughly 140 kilometers per h. According to state law, she was supposed to pay the money to the officer immediately. The policeman advised Lisa to use the closest ATM close to the road to get the money, since she didn't have that much on her. When they arrived, the terminal did not accept Lisa's credit card. The culprit, who was unable to pay the fee, was detained by the police officer. However, he released Lisa on the condition that she mail the check to the neighborhood police station. It took the young woman roughly 4 hours to get from Douglas to her boyfriend's residence by automobile. She didn't wait for her that evening, and by the time Ed got up at around 7 a.m., he had fallen asleep. Lisa was still missing at the time. He had no means to reach her because there were no cell phones. Instead, he began making calls to the 2 states' police departments. Inquiring as to whether anything had transpired, he provided information regarding Lisa and her vehicle. Despite accepting the information, the police decided not to open a case of a missing person. This was due to Lisa's age, 18, and the fact that too little time had gone since her disappearance. After a few more hours, he continued contacting their mutual friends, but none of them picked up. They were aware of her disappearance. He then attempted to reach Lisa's parents, but they weren't at home. He also contacted Lisa's boss. When they returned hours later, their phone was ringing nonstop. To find out if they had heard from their daughter, Other persons made simultaneous attempts to contact them. The parents initially believed Lisa had simply been delayed and was still traveling. It was difficult to believe that anything could have occurred to her, given that she had previously taken this path numerous times. However, time went by and she was still missing. By that time, her parents had called Ed and invited him to visit them. In such disturbing circumstances, Lisa's long-planned first encounter took place without her, and 2 days later, the young woman was still unreachable. The law mandated a 72-hour waiting period before reporting a missing individual. The parents made the decision to begin their own search rather than wait impassively. A small aircraft pilot was contracted by Lisa's father to fly over the area where the young woman was. He hoped this would assist him find where her automobile was supposed to be, but the search was fruitless. Along some of that road, the father also drove his car, but he was unable to spot Lisa. The family continued on after that. The girl's parents called a friend of theirs who was a private investigator and had previously worked for the police. He was able to persuade the neighborhood police agency to accept an early missing person complaint because of his contacts. Sadly, they found no leads, so the police were called right away. Although it was discovered that Lisa had been stopped by their patrol officer the night she vanished, her whereabouts were still unclear. There was just one thing that was certain. Between Douglas and the town of Cody, the young woman and the car had vanished. The area along that path had been searched by the authorities, but there is one major issue. There are hundreds of miles worth of farmland, woods, and mountains involved. To cover the entire area, it required months of labor and thousands of workers. The search on the ground therefore made little or no progress. On the morning of April 2nd, 8 days had gone when a guy dialed the police. He claimed to be river fishing close to Casper, Wyoming. He once recognized the body that was submerged face down in the river. The fisherman immediately assumed it was her since he had just heard on the radio that the police were seeking for a missing young woman. When detectives arrived on the scene, they pulled the body from the water and confirmed that Lisa was indeed the decedent. Medical professionals examined the body and made a dreadful discovery. Lisa passed away just 2 days prior to her body being found, so investigators had to figure out where she had been hiding out for the entire time. It was later confirmed that the young woman passed away about 6 days after going missing. The death was initially believed by the authorities to have happened roughly 5 hours after she vanished, which later caused misunderstanding. Doctors also found multiple stab wounds and contusions on the young woman's body, concluding that she had been abused while still alive. It appears that she had been thrown into the sea from a bridge while she was still aware. Later, when blood was discovered on the bridge, police corroborated this claim. Medical professionals eventually removed biological material from the victim's body, which was discovered to be a sample of male sperm that appeared to belong to the murderer. It was submitted to a lab, but at the time, DNA analysis technologies were quite limited, and the neighborhood lab lacked the tools essential to recover the offender's profile. Detectives came to the conclusion that the murderer was probably a local person who lived close to the river because of the young woman had been thrown from a bridge that was in a wilderness location that was far away, had been abandoned for a while, and required turning off the main road into a country road in order to access. Because of this, the police reasoned that only someone who was familiar with the area could have picked this bridge as a place to dump bodies. The detectives concentrated on finding Lisa's automobile because they thought the murderer had drove it somewhere and that it would contain more clues, but the car was never found. They were unable to locate it since it appeared to have dropped into the ground. In the hopes that someone would have useful information, investigators extensively disseminated information about the case to the general public. A lot of people came forward when the case was widely covered on television, and an odd thing started to happen. The police received over 100 calls in total. People claimed to have spotted Lisa in a Honda CRX with Little Miss license plates. Only these witnesses were from various states, and occasionally even from Canada. The cops believed that appeals were more persuasive. Several days following Lisa's abduction on March 26th and 27, 5 different witnesses asserted to having seen the same car with the license plate, Little Miss being driven by a young woman who remarkably resembled Lisa. The young woman had to go to work on Monday, and she would never have missed it, so it's difficult to believe that she stayed in the Casper region for a few days for whatever reason. and didn't feel the need to call her family.
One eyewitness reported seeing a male. Despite making many inquiries, the police were unable to verify that the man was actually seated in the car with Lisa. 7 photographs of the claimed individuals seen with Lisa were compiled by the investigators, but none of them were useful for the inquiry because the descriptions were too varied to single out any one man. The statements of each witness were investigated by the police. They acknowledged that the murderer may have been behind the wheel of Lisa's automobile, but they could find no logical explanation for how Lisa could have spent the weekend driving about without phoning the perpetrator. Apparently, one of the witnesses saw the killer actually drive Lisa's car to hide it, while the rest of the testimony is either incorrect or outright fraudulent. Parents can call 911 from any nearby payphone. Falls police later discovered that numerous similar automobile types were registered nearby, and it's possible that witnesses saw them while the investigation was going on. Numerous suspects were named by the detectives, but it was later discovered that none of them were connected to the case. Police received a new information 6 months later. Someone had pinned an envelope to Lisa's clothing, a grave with a letter on a man's behalf. It was stated that he regretted Lisa's passing and described it as a devastating loss. Stringfellow Hawk, a figure from a well-known TV show at the time, signed the letter. The note didn't initially appear to be odd, but every member of Lisa's family and circle of friends immediately denied any involvement. In March 1989, exactly 1 year after Lisa's passing, the police consequently reasoned that it might have been left by the killer. Disappearance information about the case was presented on a well-known television program about unsolved crimes. The police received numerous tip-off calls due to the fact that it was watched by millions of people across the nation. Detectives from the area had to put in extra time and manpower to confirm them. The volume of tips and leads that the neighborhood police station received after the episode aired, in the opinion of Lisa's parents, was too much for them to handle. They wanted the FBI to investigate the death of their daughter for this reason, but Sheriff Ron Ketchum was very opposed to the concept and declared that he had no plans to abandon the lawsuit. Nevertheless, a year later, with the backing of higher authorities, Lisa's parents were still able to enlist federal detectives in the case. They got involved in the inquiry and sought to collaborate with the sheriff, but he refused to do so or even answer their calls. The investigators were now able to examine a DNA sample from the victim's body at a federal lab because of the FBI's participation. The sample was matched to that of Lisa's boyfriend, and they didn't match. The detectives decided to be absolutely certain, even though he had never been considered a suspect before. They then made the decision to investigate the patrolman who had stopped Lisa just before she vanished. Although detectives acknowledged that he might have filed Lisa and attacked her later, he possessed a recording of a discussion with the young woman that showed him bidding her farewell. The cop gave his DNA sample right away, and it did not match that of the murderers. After a local radio station broadcast a show about Lisa's murder, the next unexpected tip was received. We're called by a witness who claimed that he had witnessed Sheriff Ron Ketchum stopping the young woman in the road on the day she vanished, and there were some pretty suspicious moments at play. The sheriff opposed the FBI's involvement in the investigation and never claimed to have stopped Lisa that evening. Then, exactly 2 years after Lisa's death, a guy abruptly left the police and made an attempt on his own life. When detectives questioned him, he was able to recover and was receiving psychological treatment. Ron, however, entered a not guilty plea and declined to give a DNA sample. The investigators started to take him seriously as a suspect because everything about him seemed suspicious. But when they were prepared to get a court order for a DNA sample a few months later, the man did offer one himself, and it did not match the killer sample. It's unclear why, if he was unrelated to Lisa's death, the sheriff was behaving in such a peculiar manner. His co-workers noted that he had always been a complex individual who had experienced Vietnam, thus before the young woman vanished, he was acting in this manner. The cops eventually ran out of solid leads. They published more information about the case in 1992, in the hopes of locating other witnesses. The primary account of the inquiry suggests that there may have been many offenders. Most likely, one man abducted and killed Lisa, but someone else assisted in getting rid of the car. The possibility of the young woman being abducted at a traffic stop at a petrol station or someplace else was also considered by the investigators, but it was ruled out. Prior to these occurrences, the young woman was very cautious, and Lisa picked her up after his car stalled on the road and another driver stopped to assist her. Because she was aware of the potential danger, the young woman did not step out of the car and merely slightly dropped her window to speak with him. The case remained unsolved for an additional 10 years because the authorities were unable to pursue any fresh leads. They didn't experience their long-awaited breakthrough until July 2002. The neighborhood's police force reopened the killer's DNA sample was the first thing entered into the FBI database during the inquiry. It wasn't used in mass across the nation until the late 1980s, and even then, it wasn't around yet. When they finally added a sample from Lisa's body, detectives discovered a match right away. The sample belonged to Dale Wayne Eaton, 59, who was incarcerated at the time. In 1997, he had been detained for using a weapon against a young couple and their young child when they were traveling through Wyoming. Wilderness. Dale drove by and stopped to assist as their car stalled. We offered the family a ride to the closest service station, which allegedly belonged to his brother, after he examined the car and indicated there was no way to fix it immediately. After agreeing, they boarded his van. Dale declared he was exhausted and needed to sleep a short distance later. He climbed into the rear of the vehicle and asked the woman to take the wheel. He grabbed his rifle and motioned for the woman to get out of the car and onto a country road as soon as it moved. Woman violently twisted the wheel, knocking Dale off balance and causing him to drop his weapon. When they exited the vehicle, the assailant reached for a knife, but the family's father quickly reached for the rifle and struck Dale with the buttstock. After that, the family climbed into his van and headed to the neighborhood police station. Dale was apprehended by detectives after they drove to the spot and found him nearby. Due to the numerous mental impairments that were discovered during his trial, they decided to put him to a closed rehabilitation center rather than imprison him. According to the authorities, he would stay there for a number of years, during which he would receive assistance in moving on with his life, finding a job, and other things. After a few months, he managed to escape, for which reason he was apprehended and given a 5-year prison sentence. What matters most in this situation is that Dale's DNA was collected before he was imprisoned and submitted into the FBI database. This led to the Lisa case's investigators ultimately finding a match. He lived nearby and was 43 years old when Lisa was killed. Law enforcement investigated Dale's past in that area and found a long list of crimes he had committed. At the age of 16, he committed his first significant crime. Dale offered to help the woman take the watermelons he had just sold her home. The woman looked at the watermelons after they arrived and noticed they were rotten. After a lengthy altercation in which she refused to pay for them, Dale stabbed her and then ran away. The following day, the man was taken into custody, and the court ordered him to receive treatment. He was identified as having many moderate mental illnesses. Following treatment, he kept switching employment since he couldn't establish himself in any position. He eventually got married, and the two went on to have 3 kids. The couple's 15-year marriage was miserable. They fought frequently and separated. He relocated to Moneta, a city only an hour's drive from Casper, in 1996. There, his in-laws had a bus converted into dwelling and numerous unfinished constructions on the property. Dale made himself at home there. Except for an occasional tiny bed, there were no living quarters in that bus. To take a shower, he would travel to a neighbor's home. Because of this, Lisa's body had DNA from a seasoned serial offender, but authorities weren't ready to arrest him because they needed more proof. Officers showed up to the precinct where he formerly resided. Nearby, a number of neighbors lived, and one of them gave the detectives an intriguing tale. Around the time Lisa vanished, Dale allegedly dug a sizable hole on his property and declared he was going to put, but that never happened, in a septic tank. When the lot was dug up, the detectives discovered Lisa's automobile with Little Miss license plates. With all of this information in hand, the police began to work gathering the evidence they would need to successfully prosecute Dale. They knew they would have plenty of time while he was inside, because Dale killed the man who shared his cell with him. He was finally charged with Lisa Kimmel's murder in April 2003. The lawsuit proceeded because the man refused to admit guilt. The prosecution called Dale's other cellmate to testify, saying that the man confessed to him about Lisa's murder and gave him all the details the young woman allegedly saw him on the side of the road, stopped, and agreed to give him a ride. At one point, Dale allegedly started to molest her but was rejected. Then he pulled a gun and ordered her to his house where Lisa was killed. But nobody accepted this explanation. Lisa's parents warned her against picking up a hitchhiker in the middle of the night in a remote location. Dale had a motive to lie. Either he told his cellmate a lie, or he made it up himself to get his sentence reduced for testifying. The investigation reveals that was not the case. Lisa most likely stopped at a petrol station before Dale attacked her there. Between Casper and Dale's house, they even mentioned a certain gas station by name. Lisa had to pass it on her way there. Cody Dale probably got into her car and used a revolver to compel her to drive to some isolated spot because he frequently drove there to use the public lavatory. Then, he brought her back to his station and held her in the bus because he had no water on the site. He took her to that bridge a few days later, stabbed her multiple times, and then threw her into the sea after deciding to get rid of her. Additionally, experts compared Dale's handwriting to that of the note placed on Lisa's grave. They discovered a lot of similarities, but despite the difficulty of calling it evidence in court, Dale was found guilty thanks to DNA evidence found on the body and the car that were both on his property. Even the lawyers were aware of this and made an effort to have their client not receive the death penalty rather than an entire acquittal. They cited the mental disorders that prevented him from accepting full accountability for his deeds, but in vain. Dale was given the death penalty when the jury found him guilty. Then Lisa's parents sued him in a civil case, which was approved by the young woman's parents, along with the fire department, destroyed all of the buildings on the land where they were located, after the court ordered that Dale be removed from it. Since Lisa's conviction, this occurred on her birthday. In 2010, the court accepted the appeal and scheduled a fresh hearing despite Dale's attorney's repeated attempts to have the death penalty revoked. The appeal was approved on the grounds that the court erred in imposing the penalty. In addition, the evidence of Dale's cellmate was seized upon by the defense team to take into account the offender's significant childhood mental disorders and developmental deficiencies. Although the man's testimony may have been made up and the jury was not informed that he had been promised a lighter sentence as a result, there is still little chance of the sentence being completely overturned. The death penalty is unlikely because Dale is still incarcerated and is currently 78 years old. In this entire narrative, there is one more point worth highlighting. In the neighborhood where Dale lived, there have been a number of unsolved homicides and mysterious disappearances of young women. Despite the lack of available proof, the police acknowledge that Dale could have been the murderer. His entire life shows a definite propensity towards crimes in Syria. This suggests that Lisa Kimmel wasn't his only victim. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like it. Thanks for watching.
The student got off the bus and was nowhere to be found. Without a trace, her body was found in a field the next day. The police looked for the killer for 39 years, but it was not until 2019 that they were able to find out what really happened. We will tell you what happened. Helene Brzezinski was born on April 6, 1958, in Huntington, which is near New York City. She was the youngest of 3 children. Her older brother and sister were 12 and 9 years old, respectively. The girl grew up with love and care, got along well with her older relatives, and was a positive, bright person. When she was 14, her father got a job offer, and the family had to move to the small town of Hamilton near Boston. There, she went to the local school and developed a passion for after high school. She went to Wheaton College, which was 110 kilometers from her town. It was close enough for her to visit her family often, and it also had a great writing program. Helen got used to being a college student quickly. She did well in school and was involved in college life. Eventually, she got a chance she was excited about. She was going to do an internship at a radio news station in Denver, even though the city was more than 3,000 miles away from our college. Helene was excited about the opportunity. In addition, her uncle and aunt lived in Denver and agreed to take her in for the internship. She also went with a classmate who studied journalism in January 1980. Helen, then 21, flew to Denver and began working at a radio station. Every day she had to take the bus from the office to her home. The trip took about 30 minutes, after which she had to walk several miles. On January 16th, she left the radio station as usual at 6 p.m. and went to the bus stop. The only thing was that she never showed up at home. Her aunt immediately began to worry because Helen had always warned her before. If she planned to be somewhere late, the woman waited a few hours. But at 11:30 she decided to go to the police. After all, investigators had already begun a search, immediately fearing that her disappearance might be connected to a recent string of attacks on women in the area. They combed the area along Helen's route all night, but could not find her in the morning. A woman approached the police. She was driving her car through a suburban area of Denver with her children. At one point, they noticed someone lying in a field near the road. The mother stopped. The car walked closer and saw the body of a young girl with no signs of life. The police arrived on the scene and immediately identified Helen. Her clothes were partially missing, her hands were tied behind her back, and all her personal belongings were also missing. Later, medical experts determined that the girl had been stabbed 9 times and abused. The death occurred between 8 and 10 p.m. A person who saw Helene get off the bus at 5:30 was able to be found by the cops. She had several kilometers to walk from the bus stop, and it appears that the perpetrator attacked her at that point. Law enforcement agencies surveyed the area near where the body was found, but they were unable to find almost any clues other than shoe impressions, presumably size 44, that led from the road to the body and back. By then, medical examiners had found biological material on the victim's body and clothing that appeared belonged to the killer, except that in those years it could not help the investigation, because the science of studying DNA was only at an early stage of development. But the samples were sent to a laboratory for storage, hoping that they would help identify the perpetrator in the future. Police turned to the public for information using newspapers and local television. They tried to find witnesses who might have seen Helen that night. Soon they were approached by a woman who, at about 10:20 p.m., saw a man near the field where the body was found. He was standing on the side of the road next to a car. Unfortunately, it was dark outside at the time, and the woman could not get a good look at the man she provided the police with, only generalities that could not help them in any way. Then the detectives took a very interesting step with the consent of the witness. They invited a hypnotist to the station, and the woman was able to remember more details, on the basis of which it turned out to draw a portrait of this unknown man. It is hard to say whether the hypnosis session really helped the investigation, but the fact remains that at that time the police had nothing but this drawing, but they could not find a single suspect, and the case froze for years. Helen's college diploma was given to her after she died as a way to remember her. The school also named an alumni award after her because she was always involved in college life. The investigation was not reopened until 1998. 18 years after the murder by then, technology in the field of DNA research had progressed markedly, and researchers had entered samples of biological material into the FBI database. Unfortunately, no matches were found. This meant that the perpetrator had no previous criminal convictions, at least not since they began taking DNA samples from convicts. 15 more years passed, and in 2013, the local police department created a unit to handle unsolved cases. They reopened the investigation into Helen's murder, but no new leads could be found. A DNA sample from the victim's body never showed up in the FBI database. This meant the girl's killer had not come to the attention of the police for other possible crimes all this time. Throughout all these years, Helen's relatives and police were not the only ones trying to find the truth. The girl's high school friends with whom she was in the choir took an active part in the investigation. Decades after her murder, they continued to press detectives to review the case regularly. They also gave interviews to get the story out to the public and distributed flyers about Helen's murder along her bus route. In 2017, the case was reopened again, and this time the detectives had much more to go on by this point. forensics had begun to make extensive use of genetic genealogy, by which the perpetrator's identity could be deduced through his relatives. Of course, this was a very complicated and time-consuming process. Moreover, this method worked only in the case if the relatives of the DNA possessor were in the publicly available genetic databases. There are several of these, and they are mostly used to search for family members. In 2018, police turned over available DNA samples to the Parabon lab, which had already helped solve hundreds of similar cases. Experts looked at about 3,000 matches, including even distant relatives of the alleged killer. They had to get rid of people who did not fit the age range or could not have committed the crime for other reasons. In the end, they decided that the person with the DNA was probably the son of a woman named June Estes, who was dead at the time. The problem was that she had 4 sons, but the lab was only able to identify 2 of them. They were 10 and 11 years old. A year went by before something unexpected happened. A woman named Jessie put her DNA sample into a public database, which was the best way to find criminals. Experts at Parabon saw that Jessie was a close relative of Helen's killer and contacted her. After a more detailed DNA test, they found that Jessie's 3rd cousin was the killer. Detectives asked the woman for information about her family to finally find the suspect. Immediately after uploading her data into the database, the woman began collecting information about her family tree and asked both of her parents to enter their DNA into the database. Through this, experts at Parabon determined that the killer was related to Jessie on her father's side. Unfortunately, the search for an answer will drag on for several more months. Expert detectives and Jessie's family worked together to get closer to the owner of the DNA from the murder scene, and soon it finally happened. The cops were able to reach a relative of June Estes, and he gave new details about her older sons. It turned out that the woman suffered from mental problems, and after her next breakdown, her father took the boys and took them to another town. Their names were William and Curtis, and the detectives were to find out which one of them was the killer. The answer was not long in coming. The Cavs immediately discovered that William had been incarcerated multiple times, and his DNA sample was entered into the FBI database in 2010. Given that the sample from Helen's body has been run through that database repeatedly since then, William was not the killer. The downside of this database is that it only shows a full match, not a partial match, even when brothers are involved. 39 years after the murder, the police had a prime suspect named Curtis White, who also went by the last name Clanton. It turned out that this man had a long criminal history. When he was 18, he knocked on a woman's door and asked to use her phone. Once inside, he grabbed a knife and abused the victim before running away. He was quickly caught and sentenced to 30 years in prison, but he was released after only 4 years because he was defended. Curtis moved in and got a job as a gardener in the area where Helen was killed. He later moved to Florida, which is where the officers went to look for him in 2019. Curtis was 62 years old at the time and worked as a trucker. Before charging him with Helen's murder, investigators wanted more hard evidence. After a week's surveillance, they got a hidden DNA sample from him, but it wasn't enough. Followed to a club, he confessed to a brutal murder. Life sentence granted at 82. Victim's family found closure after almost 40 years. Other cases possibly linked but unproven. Justice served partially. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and don't forget to like the video if you like it. Thanks for watching. In June 2000, 15-year-old Leah Freeman vanished, leaving a small town in shock. With rumors swirling and a distraught boyfriend, Nick McGuffin, desperately searching, the police investigation took unexpected twists. Witness testimonies, concealed evidence, and advanced DNA testing would lead to revelations and suspicions. Dive into the mysteries and uncover the truth behind Leah Freeman's disappearance in this video. At 10:15 p.m. on June 28, 2000, the Courtwright home received a call. The phone was answered by Corey Courtwright. Nick McGuffin, Leah's 18-year-old boyfriend, was the one who inquired as to her whereabouts. Nick had picked up Leah from their house about 4 p.m., which caught Corey off guard. Little did she realize the difficulties she would face in the future. Nick McGuffin, who was 3 years older than Leah Freeman, went to the same school as her. The two young people finally began dating after becoming acquaintances at some time. This alarmed Leah's mother, Corey, who had learned that her daughter and Nick shared more than just a spiritual bond. they also had a physical one. Around 4 p.m. on that day, Nick drove up in his vintage Mustang to pick up Leah. Leah bid her mom bye before leaving in the car. The young pair enjoyed listening to loud music while driving. Nick claims that he dropped Leah off at the home of her closest friend Sherry at around 7 o'clock. They agreed that he would pick her up from there at 9 o'clock. But when he arrived there, Leah was gone, and the guy Leah was staying with told him that they had gotten into a fight, which caused Leah to get furious and leave. Leah was nowhere to be found when Nick started driving around the streets looking for her. Nick encouraged Corey not to worry and reassured her that he would locate Leah and bring her home at around 7 a.m. as their chat came to an end. On June 29th, still waiting for her daughter to come home, Corey called Nick's house to inquire about her whereabouts. Shortly after they reported her missing to the police at the station, Nick was shocked because he thought she was at home. Leah climbed into the car with Nick, and Corey recalled the moment she last saw her daughter. He claimed that after speaking with Leah's mother on the phone, he kept driving around the city looking for the teenager, substantiating his allegation that Nick had been stopped by the police twice the day before, owing to he was pulled over by the police on several occasions, all of which he stated he was looking for Leah. He asked his buddy Kristen Steinhoff for assistance after being stopped for the second time owing to a problem with the car. They then drove around the city for nearly an hour in her car, but it did not work, and they went their separate ways. According to Nick, he then made the decision to walk close to Leah's house once more. Around 2 a.m., I noticed a light inside of her. He went back to his own house with peace of mind, assuming she was already there. Starting with his friend whom he had left Leah with the night before, the cops started looking into what Nick had disclosed. Sherry corroborated Nick's account by stating that Leah had visited her home yesterday, but fled following their disagreement. Sherry explained that Leah wanted to go for a run, but her mother wouldn't let her since Leah often gets in trouble for asking to go for a run. Nick picks her up, sending her home alone. Leah heard her friend and her mother having this chat, became offended, and left Sherry's home right away. Sherry claimed that she attempted to stop Leah, but that she was enraged and continued to leave. And while Leah was at Sherry's, Nick spent time with his friends at a nearby lake, according to his friends. Later, the authorities produced evidence indicating the young people had met there with a purpose, and Nick's involvement was a key factor in their plan. Leah loathed him and their disagreement very much. Kristen, a friend of Nick's, also corroborated his claim that they were looking for Leah in her car. There have never been any high-profile crimes in Kokyo, a little town with a population of just under 4,000. The disappearance of Leah Freeman raised a lot of controversy in the neighborhood. When Leah left her friend's home, the police looked for any witnesses who may have seen her. It was discovered that she was last observed alone in a downtown area close to her school. It's possible that she was on her way home, but it has now been discovered that she never arrived. Leah's mother disputed the police's assertion that her daughter had simply run away from home, saying her daughter had no justification for doing so. Nick's home and car were the subject of search warrants issued by the police. The only noteworthy discovery of the car search was the missing lining in the trunk. Otherwise, it was absolutely empty and devoid of any tools or a spare tire. The detectives found nothing of significance in the house. His father, Nick, began to understand that he had changed from my witness to the only suspect during the interrogation, when it was stated that everything had been taken out because of a fuel leak. Nick attempted to disregard the accusations that he was somehow connected to Leah's abduction, as he kept looking for his loved one by distributing flyers bearing her picture. 3 days after Leah Freeman vanished, something happened that caused the police's perception to shift away from the idea that the young woman might have been abducted. The woman had fled. Near the school where Leah was last seen, a man who worked at a nearby vehicle service business approached the police. He recalled that on the night of the young woman's disappearance, he had been working late and was about to leave when he saw a shoe by the roadside that looked like one of his kids' sneakers, which they occasionally brought to his business. He took it home after picking it up. The father didn't recall anything until Leah's disappearance caused a stir. He turned it over to the police after assuring them it wasn't his children's. The footwear belonged to Leah, according to the young woman's family, who confirmed this. It was discovered on Northern Elm Street close to the local school and cemetery. Her right foot belongs in the sneaker. It was Leah Freeman's shoes, according to the results of the forensic investigation. A week later, something was found that clearly suggested the missing young woman had suffered a terrible fate. Into the second sneaker Leah owned, it was in the Hudson Ridge area, about 7.5 miles from where the first sneaker was discovered, on an old logging road, a remote location where one might easily conceal themselves from prying eyes. A forensic examination of the sneaker revealed dry stains of a dark red hue that contained Leah Freeman's biological material. Leah's mother claims that the police didn't start treating her daughter's absence seriously, or stop thinking her a runaway until the sneaker was found. Were organized by the police to search the area after a second shoe was discovered. On August 3, 2000, 5 weeks after Leah Freeman vanished, one of the search teams detected a strong stench and found her body. Leah's mother, Corey Courtwright, had been holding on to the hope that her daughter would finally return home. In the vicinity of Lee Valley Road, it had been hurled over the brink of a narrow brook. The area was very forested, and there was no one there. If not for the potent stink, the body might have remained unnoticed for a lot longer. The murderer had picked a decent location nearby to conceal the body. The prolonged exposure of the body to the high temperature caused extensive decomposition, making it impossible for investigators to collect any usable evidence. Another factor was the local police's inexperience with such investigations. The map reveals the following. Leah was last seen close to the school, not far from where her right shoe was discovered. The body was recovered 2.5 miles from the place where the left sneaker was found, which was located 5 miles from the right one. The cops were further perplexed by the body's detachment from the shoes. As a result, after the body was discovered, the inquiry stalled rather than making the anticipated progress. The police were reticent to divulge anything, and it was clear from the lack of any arrests or charges that they had no solid leads. Meanwhile, rumors started to circulate despite the fact that the young man appeared to be grieving over his loved one's passing. Most people in the small village of Coquille think that Leah's boyfriend, Nick McGuffin, was involved in everything and was concealing something. The majority of people accused him. As they had no other suspects, the police again called him in for interrogation. Despite their pressure, however, there were no breakthroughs in the investigation. It became clear that the investigation had reached a standstill a year later. Police did not have any fresh suspects. Nick. After another 6 years passed, the small town that was shaken by the high-profile crime slowly returned to normal. In 2007, Nick's daughter was born, and society started to accept him again. However, for Leah's mother, Corey Courtwright, life seemed to have stopped the day she lost her daughter. She never stopped reminding the local police chief about the unsolved case 8 years later. The detectives were unpleasantly surprised to find that the evidence gathered in 2000 was dispersed, and some of it was completely useless. Witness testimonies from that time were reviewed, and dozens of people were interviewed once more, including Kristen Steinhoff, Nick's friend. Mark Daniels took over the Coquille police, and he gave the case a fresh perspective by assembling a team of specialists from across the state. Her remarks on the night of her disappearance were different from what she had claimed 8 years prior. She recalled how Nick visited her home that evening about midnight, and the two of them had a cigarette. Nick then began kissing her, but it didn't last long since she objected. Nick McGuffin was called in for additional questioning after her testimony rekindled earlier suspicions about him. Kristen's testimony was corroborated, and he acknowledged that what she had stated was accurate, but he had been reluctant to do so in 2000 when the police had publicly suggested that Leah might have. The most surprising development was the appearance of a witness years later who claimed to have seen Leah and Nick after she left her friend's house. Leah was only 15 at the time, which could have provided a motive for Nick to commit the crime and could have landed him in jail. Leah Freeman's body was discovered on August 23, 2010, 10 years after she passed away. Her boyfriend Nick McGuffin was taken into custody and accused of being the cause of death. The prosecution used the testimony of 2 witnesses during the trial. Leah and Nick were allegedly seen by a witness at 9 o'clock. The day she vanished, close to the establishment where the first pair of sneakers was discovered. Nick allegedly tried to drag Gila into a car as they were shouting. According to the prosecution, it was at this time when Nick allegedly hurt Leah, as evidenced by the stains on the shoes. Someone who claimed to have had an argument with Nick in 2002 and that Nick had threatened to treat him the same way he treated Leah was the second and most significant witness. This accusation was understood as this witness was the ex-boyfriend of the young lady Nick subsequently married, which would have influenced his testimony, but the prosecutor ruled out the likelihood of prejudice. Nick McGuffin refused to confess guilt, but in the absence of any tangible proof, he only had the testimony of witnesses. Nick McGuffin was found guilty of Leah Freeman's involuntary manslaughter by 10 of the jury's 12 members. When the verdict was revealed on July 19, 2011, 11 years after she passed away, he received an 11-year prison term. The mother experienced her first moment of comfort upon learning that the person who had kidnapped her daughter was now in jail, but the narrative doesn't end there. In 2014, Nick McGuffin's relentless insistence on his innocence and his prolific letter writing to multiple human rights organizations produced results. One of these organizations became interested in his case, and Jazz Parakow, his new attorney, started looking into the facts and witness accounts that had led to the guilty conviction. As she learned, in addition to the police concealed vital information that would have impacted the jury's verdict due to the lack of tangible proof connecting Nick McGuffin to the killing of Leah Freeman. The fact that Leah's clothing contained traces of gray automotive paint that did not coincide with the hue of Nick's car during the trial was kept a secret. Although it was stated that the Mustang's interior had been completely cleaned when it was originally checked, pictures from that time clearly showed otherwise. Witness statements disputed the prosecution's witnesses' assertions that I witnessed Leah and Nick fighting outside the school at around 9 o'clock. But these unreported testimonies claim they weren't brought up in court. Leah was seen by witness Nick Backman at 9 o'clock. Leah was out on her own that evening while he was at an ATM. Additionally, the authorities seized the ATM videotape, which showed that his meeting occurred at precisely 9:04 p.m. In the 10 years between the discovery of the corpse and the footwear and Nick McGuffin's arrest, during which time technology advanced, one of the most serious instances of police professionalism occurred, had significantly progressed, especially in the area of DNA testing. As is well known, one of the sneakers identified as containing Leah Freeman's biological material in 2000 had significant crimson stains. The police mysteriously chose not to send the footwear for more examination after 10 years, and the chance to learn more using new technologies. This decision ultimately had a big impact on Nick McGuffin's life. The attorney got in touch with the lab that had tested the shoes in order to request a copy of the original DNA analysis result in 2000 and was shocked to learn that, in addition to Leah's DNA, his DNA had also been discovered on the footwear. However, the male DNA was so minute that at the time, technology could not further identify it, and its discovery was no longer mentioned anywhere in the police records. Nevertheless, the police decided not to conduct a further investigation in 2010, despite having all the available options. The footwear were submitted for re-examination in 2017, thanks to Nick's defense, and the results showed that both male and female DNA was present. However, the detected samples were so small that it was impossible to obtain comprehensive information for comparison with the FBI database. They could only reveal similarities when compared directly to the DNA of the person who left them. The sneakers, both inside and outside, did not belong to Nick McGuffin. Nick McGuffin's guilty judgment was reversed on November 29, 2019, and his case was given back to the prosecutor who had been in charge of it during the 2011 trial. The prosecutor claimed that simply because McGuffin was found guilty was overturned doesn't mean he's innocent, given that Nick had already completed nearly all of his 11-year sentence and the new evidence. The prosecutor chose not to pursue a new trial against him. On December 17, 2019, Nick McGuffin was released from prison. He now intends to hold the authorities accountable for erasing 10 years from his life. The investigation into Leah Freeman's killing is still ongoing, but possibly new techniques will one day be developed that will allow for a more precise identification of the murderer. Mom Corey Cartwright is still of the opinion that the individual is Nick McGuffin. Share your opinion about this story in the comments and don't forget to like this video. If you enjoyed it, thank you for watching.